I'm Nathan Ruiz, Senior Vice President at Govini, where each day my team and I get to work with federal and DoD clients solving very difficult problems, many of which revolve around supply chains. It's my honor to introduce our first panel of the day, the new gray zone, supply chain hegemony. Supply chains truly underpin all the mission sets that are foundational to global commerce and economic security. They're incredibly complex, and even one small operational functionality can all depend on one piece of a supply chain. Now more than ever, our adversaries seek to insert themselves and disrupt supply chains of critical technologies, and nations are fighting to ensure that their own supply chains are defended from that interference. Today we'll get a better understanding of what the US supply chains are facing, where they're most vulnerable, and how the United States can truly leverage all of the tools at its ready to confront these problems. So please join me in welcoming the panelists to the stage. Standing in for Lieutenant General Mohan, who couldn't make it today, is Dr. Jerry McGinn. Dr. McGinn is the Executive Director for the Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. He's joined by the Honorable Alan Estevez, Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security, Alan Thompson, the Vice President of Government Affairs at Intel Corporation, and moderator, Vago Muradian, founder of Defense and Aerospace Report. Enjoy and welcome.
Good morning, everybody. It is an honor and pleasure to be here with this august panel and at this great event. Special thanks to Nathan, Tara, Jeb, and the entire Govini team who've been doing a terrific job. As Nathan said, this is actually one of the most fascinating areas of national and international security, especially at a time when we're both trying to build up our capabilities, but also deal with adversary powers who have nefarious intent. And Alan, you have been somebody who is actually at the very crux of all of these dynamics, both to build up national capabilities, while at the same time also degrading the capabilities of adversary nations that are increasingly developing their own indigenous capacities, but also looking to third nations in order to build their capabilities up. From your standpoint, nobody collects more data than the Commerce Department. I was fortunate enough to be subject to a couple of commerce surveys and know how incredibly detailed they are. Do you have the appropriate visibility into all the vulnerabilities of our supply chain at this point, as you also execute a plan to help rebuild capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vago. Thank you for that. First, let me thank Govini, Tara, Nathan, for having us here. I think this is an incredibly important topic. I go back when I was running logistics in the Pentagon, before I was the principal deputy 18L, when there was an 18L. If I started talking about supply chains, that was like the signal for most people to yawn and leave the room, right? That is no longer the case. If people didn't wake up to supply chain issues during COVID, certainly the invasion of Ukraine brought that to bear as well. And now people understand that there's vulnerabilities across the planet. Do we know where all our gaps and holes are? No, the answer is no. Fortunately, there's companies like Govini that do help on that. There's a number of other providers that are capable. My office is doing some survey work through Defense Production Act Authority. In fact, we're going to roll one out today on legacy chips. My counterpart under Marissa Lago, the Undersecretary for Trade at the Department of Commerce, her Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis, Grant Harris, has stood up a whole supply chain team that is looking at different aspects of supply chains to look at those vulnerabilities. Because it's not just rare earths and it's not just chips. There's gaps all over the place. So in any 12-step program, step one is to understand that you have a problem.
Right.
Step two is to start analyzing where those holes are, and that's what we're doing.
Are there areas that are more, right, that you could say are the most troubling, right? Even if you don't have that total situational awareness yet, what are the ones that you know, as you look at that national industrial and national security dashboard, and I'm going to go to Jerry in a minute on this, that are flashing either amber or red, or where they're green actually, that you don't have to worry about?
Yeah, I mean, we can start with chips. You know, Alan's sitting next to me, of course, from one of the biggest fabricator of chips in the globe. But the fact that we do not make any advanced, highest end advanced node chips in the United States is a big problem. Fortunately, last year Congress passed the CHIPS Act. The Commerce Department's in the process of doling out the $39 billion that's allocated towards building fabrication capability back into the United States. You know, that's what we call our offensive side of our equation in this, and we're going to talk about the defensive side in a moment. But even when we dole out that $39 billion, you know, I think at the Reagan Forum, my boss, Secretary Raimondo, said, you know, she's going to be in the business of doling out disappointment, because that $39 billion is not sufficient to provide all the capacity and capability we need. So what we'll end up with is assured capability and capacity in the United States, but not sufficient capability and capacity in the United States for the chips that we need. The other place I'd jump immediately to is, again, rare earths. And rare earths are abundant. It's not like they're rare, but the processing and getting them has, because of cost considerations, all essentially migrated to China. So when I start doing things on the export control side, they're doing things on the rare earth side that at some point is going to come bite us if we don't get our act together around that. And fortunately, again, there's a lot of work going on in that, both with the our European allies and with our Asian allies, on what are the right sources, how do we develop processing capability, you know. So there's work going on, but again, you know, we're in a place where we're in a gap.
I was remiss, before starting off, I should have asked for a chart from Govini ARC that, oh look, the number of Chinese components that actually are in some of our most sensitive weapon systems. And so I think that underscores sort of the magnitude of the challenge, and certainly was one of the drivers behind chips. Jerry, I want to ask you, you spent a lot of time in the department as a bipartisan servant, and it was Deputy Defense Secretary Bill Lynn who asked one of your colleagues and predecessors, Brett Lambert, to do a sector-by-sector, tier-by-tier analysis at the time to find out where those choke points are in the national defense industrial system. And Brett, being Brett, looked a little bit beyond what was purely in national security, but from a national industrial capability. Dr. Laura Taylor-Calais has just rolled out the first ever national defense industrial strategy, and supply chain resilience is number one on that. Where do we stand in having that DoD visibility into where our vulnerabilities are, and whether or not this strategy is the right way to try to address some of those shortcomings? Because they left for a reason, right? I mean, some of these guys got out of these businesses for very good reasons.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Vago, and it's great to be here with you all. These are not new problems. So a lot of the areas that have been a focus for the last better part of a decade were identified through bipartisan efforts under the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now currently the Biden administration, looking at vulnerabilities in our supply chains. And they're by and large have been identified as areas that are kind of in the sub-tier supplier. And there's sort of two sets of kind of vulnerabilities that have been exposed into COVID and Ukraine. One is sort of a capacity in the supply chain, the ability to have enough being produced, and that's more of a capacity issue. The other one is sort of the capability challenge, where you've got some materials and some processed materials are produced in adversarial countries. And the report I was involved in government, the Executive Order 13806, found over 20 kind of areas where we were in a sole or single source challenge with respect to capability made in China. And that's around rare earth processing, magnets, batteries, specialty chemicals, and the like. And that's been a focus going forward, has been under the subsequent administrations in investing in those. And you've seen a lot being used in the Defense Production Act to get after, and other kind of authorities to get after that. And the CHIPS Act that Alan is living that dream every day. But it's important to address these, because these capabilities left for two reasons. One is that we focused as an economy on optimizing for commercial success and a global system, and these areas, these capabilities, a lot of them have defense applications, but they're way down the supply chain, and the department doesn't move the needle on these, and they don't buy them. And the second is there's an actual industrial policy by specifically China on getting a strong position in these kind of areas. And they haven't gotten to microelectronics production, but they have in these other areas, and that's where we're trying to turn that around, and some of the efforts have been underway the last several years.
Alan, Intel is pretty much at the very center of almost every element of the national and indeed international economy. United States, as we were talking before we got started, one of pretty much three nations that has the capability to produce chips of this quality. Obviously Japan and South Korea are the two other nations, and obviously the allies and partners make the lithography machines and what have you. Ultimately, we're making a big investment. We're trying to hamper our adversaries. How do you gauge the efficacy and the success of those efforts as part of a broader sort of strategic roadmap? Because you guys are thinking 10, 15 years out at any given time.
Yeah, it's great to be with you guys this morning. Maybe I'll start with the fact that when I first went into work in government as a congressional staffer now almost 20 years ago, the paradigm driving supply chain policy was don't disturb efficiency, no matter what, right? And I think the good news is we're now at a place where we're like, let's maintain efficiency, but we have to build in resiliency. And I think there's a lot of efforts going towards that. And, I think if you just look at what the CHIPS and Science Act has unleashed, in a way we sympathize for what the Commerce Department has to decide, as Alan mentioned, in terms of, dishing out disappointment, only in that there is now a lot more investment happening in the United States in terms of cost and what the government can actually support. But that's a good thing, right? Because you can now see a supply chain that is becoming much more resilient all the time. I will tell everybody that if Intel's projects in the United States are successful, and I have every reason to believe that they will be, we will be making leading edge chips in the United States within the next 2 to 3 years, period. And so I think that's a great thing too. The challenge that we're going to have to manage as you look at this in terms of these public-private partnerships is every industry is unique and they have unique challenges. Ours is scale and cost, right? And so if you look at kind of what manufacturing in our industry looked like even 20 years ago, there were 18 companies that can make all kinds of the kind of current most leading edge chips. In 2024, there's down to 3. One is Samsung in South Korea, you have TSMC in Taiwan, and in the United States, it's us, right? And so the challenge that I think we're gonna have to manage is, on the one hand, because of the national security threats that certain nations pose, you're dealing with the need to address degradation. At the same time, though, there are other national security objectives, I would argue, in terms of supply chain resiliency and how a company like Intel will be able to support the Department of Defense that you have to balance as well. And so the thing I would I would say focus on is I think CHIPS is doing what it's supposed to do. I think not only on the grant side, but the investment tax credit that's part of that law will allow us to sustain it. But the challenge we're going to have to deal with is when you look at this from a geopolitical standpoint, the capability only rests in certain places. And we would argue that ensuring that we have the ability to continue to manufacture here and grow here is key. The other challenge in terms of the visibility that even I've learned as I've come to work at Intel is the semiconductor supply chain is global and there's got a lot of single points of failure. It's Japan, it's Europe, but components come from all over the world. You have to have all of them, and I think looking at how we continue, not only look at the manufacturing of chips, but the ecosystem itself is going to be the thing that I think we have to gain more visibility on and do more partnerships.
And I stand corrected, I erroneously said Japan, it was Taiwan. I was thinking about lithography machines along with our Dutch friends who make them. Let me,
but they use them in Korea too.
They use them in Korea and everywhere else as well. Alan, we did CHIPS Act and we did science, which is great, and I'm going to go back to Alan in a second, but I wanted to get your sense from you, right? We have a tendency of sometimes, right, we didn't want to disrupt anything. That's why we let China get away with as much as we did, because we wanted stability at the end of the day, and we can keep out inventing them, and then until we realize like maybe we might not be. We also are now learning that there are multiple other elements of these supply chains, right, that we also need to deal with. Printed circuit boards, for example, which is a very important part of the ecosystem, is not getting that investment. And if you look at it, there are discrete slices across it. What does phase 2, phase 3 of this need to look like if we're to address the strategic vulnerabilities we have across the entire piece? And maybe want to get Jerry's take on that as well from a national security standpoint that stops short of just merely subsidizing American companies, right, that may not be competitive, because that is the last refuge of the scoundrel, but actually manage to scratch those itches that we do have.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of tools in the toolbox around this. And again, we've talked rare earths, we've talked chips here. We can go into batteries, the whole electric vehicle, autonomous vehicle ecosystem is also highly dependent on adversarial supply chains, which are heavily subsidized. Chips in China also very heavily subsidized. And to Alan's point, I'm taking revenue away from him at the same time I'm giving him subsidy here to build out that ecosystem for the protection of the national security side of this, right? So, we have to look at, where do tariffs mean something? Where does 232 type assessment mean something? Look, I have a 232 request on garlic. That's probably not one that we're going to jump on. But, you have to look at the whole...
You got to give them credit for going after it, right? I mean...
My friends on the Hill. But we have to look at all the tools, including export controls, including tariffs, including work with our allies, in partnership with our allies, and letting the economy flow the way it should. But we also have to make up for the market forces that are off kilter because of the amount of money that China is throwing into their marketplace.
Jerry?
Much of which is going to naught, by the way.
That's true, but if you throw enough money at it and you've educated enough people at Stanford and MIT and Cambridge and who apprenticed at Intel, eventually they're going to be able to develop this capability. Jerry, let me quickly go to you from a DoD standpoint, right? I mean, we'll see what is in the 25 budget request from the administration, but ultimately, how do you do this without a lot of extra money in the, because people are like, we can think our way through this. Can we think our way through this in part because government tends to be fickle when it comes to actually executing the plans that it touts? No.
Yeah, well, I think what the approach that the current and the previous administrations have taken, I think is the right one. They're looking to address the supply chain vulnerabilities by making targeted government investments, but all of these investments require some kind of commercialization strategy, some kind of cost share by the companies involved in being invested in, because the recognition by Alan's not going to be funding chips for they're not good. This is not a $50 billion a year kind of program. This is sort of, we want to restart these capabilities or bring them, near-shore them or friend-shore them, and so doing that is critical. So that is where I think this is important to make these investments, but we got to recognize that these businesses, these industries went away for a reason. Some of that was our intention, like I mentioned, and some of it was industrial policy by China. And we have to be conscious on be able to sustain these kind of capabilities and having a market, so it's not a permanent kind of government investment every year. And that's going to be, I think, key going forward.
Alan, despite all of Alan's efforts and State Department efforts and pressure on allies and partners, the Chinese are still demonstrating that they can make some pretty sophisticated chips, right? I mean, it was actually on Secretary Raimondo's visit that they, just to say that we will work together where we can, but disagree where we can't. That, there's a lot of debate. Was it a 9 nanometer chip, 7, 6, 5, what have you? Okay. That ain't bad. So, Alan, from your standpoint, what does this look like as you look forward? And what are the implications of the Chinese actually being able to deliver these chips? Because the concern is that once we said we're going to war with you in order to hamstring you, to stop you from accessing these chips, and as well as to hurt their AI efforts as well, the Chinese are going to do what the Russians did, which is build their own ecosystem to develop this. What are the implications of this, and how do you gauge their progress before they're able to do this beyond our reach?
I think Intel has a very unique perspective on it in a way, right? And I will say this, I think the work that BIS has done has actually been very effective. And what I mean by that is 7 nanometer capability advanced? Yes. But Moore's law has not slowed down. And so when you look at the value proposition of where the future semiconductors are going, they're stuck, right? They will have a very difficult time doing what we can do at 4, 2 or 3 nanometer and beyond, right? And those are the products that are really going to start to take off within the next decade. And so in a lot of ways, I would say, do they have a capability? Yes. But in our industry, the ability to scale and produce what we call yield is really, really important. So you can have capability, but if you don't have the ability to continue to advance and produce at scale with good yield, it's really hard to be a leader and a driver. We have experience in terms of how they came up with their ability to get the 7 nanometer, because we tried it. It's not fun. And so I think because of some of the equipment restrictions that have taken place along with the export controls, they're going to be stuck for a while. And I think when you look at it from that standpoint, it's worked. Now the trick's going to be, and this is where DoD and some of the other partnerships come in, is how do you allow companies to continue to advance with Moore's law, which again gets more expensive over time, in a way that allows us to not only support the consumer, but the warfighter. And that's going to be the next supply chain challenge. And so I would say this, are the Chinese throwing a lot of money at this? Absolutely. But there are certain capabilities that they cannot replicate, no matter how well you're educated or what you can invest in. And if they can't do that. What you can steal? Yeah, but what you could steal, but I would even say, there's a whole bunch of efforts, even on the industry side, to ensure that the IP is protected to do this. And so, the way I would look at it is as long as they are a decade or more so behind, we're going to have a pretty good advantage to be able to continue to evolve and maintain, I would say the kind of capability that we would want. But I think going back to the need of how you sustain this, I think I think the recognition of needing diversity in your supply chain is going to drive that sustainment, right? I don't think anybody's comfortable with the proposition of having 80% of the world's semiconductors manufactured in Asia anymore, right? And so I think that is one thing that's happening. It's not just the US CHIPS Act, the EU is doing the same thing, right? I think the real key is going to be, are we comfortable with maintaining a decade or so lead, right? And now I always joke he has one of the hardest jobs in Washington because, as he mentioned, right, on the legacy side of the house and the other chips that are being made, that's probably where I would be more worried about where Chinese could actually become a real problem. China can be a real problem.
So let me just jump on a couple of things that Alan said there. First of all, agree with most of what you said. I don't know that we're a decade ahead. In certain areas, probably so, less so. The problem with the Chinese capability of making a 7 nanometer chip, and working towards a 5-nanometer chip using a process, as you said, that is not the optimum process, and they do not have the capability because they don't have the machines, not because they don't have the engineering capacity and capability. They have that. What they don't have is the right tool. And that's because of work between us and our allies to prevent them from getting those tools. But you don't need high yields to make a chip for military application if you're willing to subsidize it substantially, which they are. So the fact that they made a 7-nanometer chip for a Huawei phone that actually has less capability than the phone they were making in 2019 with a chip that was a 5-nanometer chip that was fabbed at TSMC is interesting, but it's not like shaking to the national security. The fact that they can make a 7-nanometer chip that can go into military applications, even at and I can't say the yield number here, although I have an idea of what it is, it's very low. They can do that from a they can subsidize that, right? So that's what we need to be concerned about. To your point, I think our export controls are working from that standpoint. And then you got to look at, the chips that we're denying them, that they're not fabricating, for the highest end AI chips that you make, that NVIDIA or AMD is making, and then a number of little startups around the globe. So yes, Huawei or using SMIC or their own fab capability can make a chip that's certainly not as good as an A100 NVIDIA chip. But getting closer.
It's good enough.
It's good enough with cost. But the reality is, the next version of those chips is going to be so much better than the chips that are out there today. That's where the gap is going to continue to open. And we need to continue to run faster as they are held stagnant. And they can't get their chips fabbed anywhere anymore either because of our controls.
I guess the question is, have we considered what happens when they build an ecosystem that we no longer can touch to produce these chips? So as we look out 5 years, 10 years, right? So we may have a 10-year lead. We don't know, by the way, what's going to happen in that 10 years in terms of the progress that they might make and the breakthroughs. They are spending a lot of money on quantum and a whole bunch of other capabilities. And chips obviously is a multiplier effect, right? That we're putting money to develop this capability. They do it sort of more through brute force, maybe. Alan, what happens when the export controls don't really work anymore and they actually develop an ecosystem with the Russians or whoever else? And what does that potentially mean for us? I mean, have we thought those steps through?
Well, absolutely, we've thought them through. Obviously, we can't see completely what those things are, but as we debate whether this control is right or wrong, that is one of the factors we put in. Are we driving them to have that ecosystem that eventually we won't be able to have a choke point control on? The reality is they're spending a lot of money to do that anyway, both on the chip side and on the ability to make tools. But they are way behind in lithography. And making an EUV machine that ASML in the Netherlands makes is not an easy matter. Making the machines that Applied or Lam or KLA makes in the United States or Tokyo Electron makes in Japan, not an easy thing. So they'll have capability, but it won't be at the same level of capability that we have. Next point on that is, again, our companies, Intel being one of them, the other great chip, whether they're fabless or fabrication chip companies, or those of our allies, including companies like Samsung, are going to advance while they are trying to figure out how to get to where we are today. So the gap is going to widen as we go forward.
I saw your finger go
Yeah, no, I think if we're in a situation where the Chinese are trying to build their own ecosystem, that's a win for us, right? Because the first thing we need to do is get is get our capabilities get those adversarial capabilities out of our supply chains, right? If they're then having to create their own ecosystem, it's just not going to be as capable because the advances of our companies like Intel and our allies. I mean, I'm not trying to be arrogant, but that's just that's where it is now. And so, I mean, we'd have to figure out a way to kind of get into that, and that's intelligence and the like. But if they're going that strategy, I think that's a win for us.
The challenge is going to be, though, is you still need access to that market to drive the revenue to continue to maintain or either grow that lead, right? And that's where the rubber in some ways is going to meet the road, right? So as Alan mentioned, when he says on the one hand, a company like Intel will receive CHIPS grants, on the other, some of the enforcement mechanisms cost us revenue. That's where I think that's going to be the rub, because in essence, for us to be able to stay competitive, not just against China, but I would argue even against our allies in South Korea and Taiwan, we have to still be able to keep up with them, right? And be able to continue to invest and maintain our manufacturing operations here. You know, just to put a kind of point in terms of scale, if you look at what we're building in the United States in terms of manufacturing facilities in Ohio, in Arizona, advanced packaging in New Mexico, and then all the technology development that has to happen here in Oregon, right? We're going to build that out in the next 5 to 6 years. The key is, can we sustain it and continue to expand upon it over the next decade? And that's going to be the rub as well. So it's because we don't look at it as not only in terms of how the U.S. is competing with China, we're still competing with South Korea and Taiwan as well in terms of having semiconductor capability that keeps the U.S. in the lead.
But the reality is that market's going to dry up anyway, by their own desires, right? I mean, China, give them credit for this. And first of all, they're smart, they have engineers, and like they have great capability there. So we shouldn't underestimate. When they put out a plan, they actually follow their industrial policy plan, right? So they say, I am going to be self-sufficient in this, and they're going to march forward and be self-sufficient. Now, what capability they'll have when they reach that, right, you know, is to be said. But they're going to drive U.S. and allied companies out of their marketplace eventually anyway.
No, you're right. I mean, look, if they could replace us tomorrow, they would.
Yeah.
Right? But they can't. And, I think that's the other key piece of how we look at some of this, which is they would love to replace us, but it's hard for them to, right? At least if you want a certain capability. And that's the one thing that I always come back to, which is capability in our industry really, really matters. Right, for all the criticism that Intel has taken over the last couple of years, it wasn't because we couldn't manufacture or design chips. We weren't doing it at a capability that both from a national security standpoint and a commercial industry standpoint, people really need and wanted. We're going to take care of that, right? But I think that's the other piece here, that as we look at this going forward, it's capability, capacity, and ensuring that the U.S. is going to basically be in the lead. I do think, that's one of the great things that has happened with something like the CHIPS and Science Act, which is it is a whole of government approach and a public-private partnership to look at, okay, we are now going to be in a position to where we will have a seat at this table going forward, not only in terms of just design, but also in manufacturing and supply chain resiliency. And I think, the beauty of that is, even though you could argue other nations may spend more than the United States, we also have unique capabilities and things that have made investing here more attractive again, that I think over the long run is going to play a really big dividend for the country.
How do we, Alan, you mentioned strategy, right? And a lot of our allies and partners have acquisition strategies that are more logical, take into account industrial-based considerations, rate of manufacture and the like, to make sure that it is sustainable, right? I mean, if you're France, you have to have the Rafale be in production long enough that you get into the next generation of airplanes. We have so much money that our plans change all the time. We launch a lot of half-baked stuff. You were part of a team along with Frank Kendall who tried to kill the half-baked, and instead they killed and dismantled your job. So at least you had that going for you. Tough to get a laugh in this room, alas. Even with that line.
I thought it was funny.
It's just a barrel of monkeys. So at the end of the day, how do we do this better and more strategically. I'll give you an example, not to bring nuclear submarines into this. We've wanted to get to 2 Virginia-class attack boats a year. We're at 1.3. We're putting almost $5 billion in investment in the submarine industrial base. There are fantasies about getting to 3 boats a year, and then, Australian subs on top of that. But if you actually talk to the guys who are in the manufacturing side of things, they actually don't believe that we're actually going to get there. There are a whole bunch of bottlenecks we're not getting there, and indeed next year, the surest sign is spending money, and next year the Navy might order 1 nuclear attack submarine might be in its budget. Okay, so how do you do industrial planning on this and maybe go down the line? And what are the demand signals and the commitments that we need to make, right? It's either 2 subs a year or 5 attack submarine equivalents with Columbia, or it's not. Whereas we have a tendency of messing around with numbers and, well, we might buy 100 B-21s, or it might be 75, it might be 150. I mean, what do we need to do here to send industry that demand signal so that they can invest? Because at the end of the day, these are businesses with a fiduciary obligation to make money.
So a couple of things.
Sorry for the long question.
And, I'm obviously not Bill LaPlante, so I won't answer Bill LaPlante's question on that. But let's start with, industrial policy in the United States has always been a kind of shaky thing, going back to Alexander Hamilton, right? Because we let the economy and the marketplace take its course. And there's great benefit to that, right? In the defense sector, which is a narrower segment than the economy writ large, what you do need is stable budgets and projections. So let's start with pass the goddamn budget. Pass the goddamn budget regularly, and maybe on time once in a while would go a long way towards giving some stability in programs. And then, of course, the programs are going to move to the threat. But, Bill LaPlante and I had this conversation that, if we were on a stage like this in 2019 and we started talking about, hey, the ability to make 155 rounds, we would have been told, well, you guys are old school, what does the matter with you? Guess what? We need the capability to make 155 rounds. We need the capability to make the new stuff too, and to adapt both. So, we can walk and chew gum in this place at the same time. But having a stable budget and then being able to project that out would go a long way.
Alan?
I would tell you that it's actually happening. And believe it or not, it actually is, the timing is working out really well. So years ago, the Department of Defense, recognizing they needed microelectronics to continue to evolve, right, started a partnership with industry to really focus on how do we do secure design, secure manufacturing in the United States, but allows us to keep up with the arc of technology, right? And those programs have been funded and have come to their fruition to where, that systems is coming together where there's going to be an integration into companies like Intel to be able to have access to the state-of-the-art commercial technology that will go to the warfighter, right, and serve their needs. The beauty of that is when you pair that with kind of the new industrial policy strategy that just came out, right, that will actually give a framework to start the transition from going from kind of the research and prototype phase to the actual production phase. I agree with the Undersecretary on the need for the budget, because I will promise you the challenge is going to be the framework and the strategies coming together. If you don't have the purchasing power, that's a problem. Right. And it's a problem for an industry like ours for one reason. The cost to build and operate a semiconductor fab is not getting cheaper, right? It's literally doubled in the last decade or so. And so the way our business model works is success for us is you have to have enough commercial product and volume going through the fab to basically pay for lithography machines, for example. And the challenge you have in the defense space is they need certain products, but never enough of a volume that's going to justify that. Right. So if we don't have the demand signal, either because they can't get the budget, that's a problem. But it's coming because if you really think about it, what in your life is not becoming more digital? And if you think about what's going to be needed from an AI capability, there's no way you do that without leading edge semiconductors. So the good news is it's all coming together. You just need the continued budgetary support and focus to allow these programs to transition to where we're actually producing,
Right.
and we're going to be in pretty good shape.
I mean, I would point out, I think Frank Kendall is, Air Force Secretary Kendall is right on the mark, right? He's like, we don't have an innovation problem, we have a money problem. We have the ideas, we have the plans. The question is the stable and steady funding to help execute it. Jerry, just on the broader theme of better planning.
Yeah, I know. I think, I agree with all these points, and I like to take a step back from the chips focus because, this is a broader industrial base kind of issue, and you've seen that having stable demand is critical in this space, and fixing that is really important. But it's also kind of how we approach these supply chain issues, from chips to rare earths and the like. It's going to be a whole of government kind of approach to help these supply chain sectors, and that's why it's really good that that Alan's other job, the export control piece, is really kind of getting strong, because we have to build the capabilities, but then we have to be able to respond when there's industrial policy from adversaries. If they start choking us on rare earth processing, that we can be able to put sanctions on them and the like. So government policy, and it's going to be more than DoD. But another thing that needs to be important, needs to be thought about in terms of supply chains, is how we buy. It's not just kind of the amount, but how we buy. So how we design systems, how we contract for things, how we budget for them, so that we can flip the script on these long, really long development programs. But we need to have some of those for the most elegant systems, but we need to be able to design for producibility, or the ability to contract for the ability to surge. And these are all things that involve supply chain kind of capacities, but overall kind of industrial capacities in the department.
That's a very, very key point, because I think that's when I talk about from the semiconductor standpoint, the transition to be able to sustain and purchase, that's going to be the thing, is how do you buy them? Right, and making sure that we do our best to comply with the government framework, but it's got to be one that kind of fits a commercial model, because otherwise it just takes too long and you just waste a lot of money.
I want to go to allies and partners here in the remaining 10 or so minutes that we've got. I think the administration does deserve a little bit of credit for actually trying to do whole of government in a way where everybody is getting along well in the sandbox. Having covered administrations, that there have been blood on the walls, blood and hair on the walls at the end of some of these meetings. Alan, maybe let me start with you. Right, the administration has made Buy America, and the president has talked about that as foundational to its national and international strategy, even if it irritates some allies and partners, while at the same time making a case for friendshoring and the role of those very allies and partners. What's the right balance here? Because our allies and partners, including many and some in this room, have capabilities we could be using right now. I have no dog in this fight. RTX is putting the Stinger missile in production, and there's bringing retirees back in to weave the gyros for this. MBDA's got a chip, they'll sell it to you right now off the shelf that does the exact same thing, probably for less money and higher reliability, no offense. What's the role we need to take in this, and what's the step change we need? We obviously want them to set up a factory in the United States, but at some point, aren't we above that? And don't we need to actually make some selective calls to just acquire capability from our friends instead of reinventing the wheel all the time?
Yeah, I think, first of all, we also did AUKUS. We're also doing things in IPAF, TTC in Europe. All these things are working with our allies, including on what's their industrial capability and capacity. When I was in Asia in October last year. I was in Asia a couple times this year, and all the discussion I had with my Japanese and my Korean counterparts, aside from talking about what I'm doing on export controls, was about building out rare earth capability, not just with them, because they also need to go elsewhere, but where can we work together to do that? So The discussions are ongoing. Does the United States need capability and capacity in the United States? Yes, we do. We're a big country, and we should be able to sustain that. But that doesn't mean we need to buy everything here. We need to work with our allies in doing that, and we need to have a global trading base to do that. If we go to war with these people being our friends and allies, and we need to be able to work with them and work with their companies. And then you have that equation going. If you look at things like AUKUS, where we're going to help build out the Australian industrial base. And I think that's critical. And we're working towards that.
Alan?
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the things that we focused a lot of attention on is on the manufacturing supply, even of the components of the semiconductor supply chain. Mexico has an amazing value proposition to be able to do that. But it's not just that. On the rare earths, I literally just had a conversation with the Canadian ambassador to the United States, right? When you start to talk about it, you talk about a country with an abundance of rare earths and capability. Canada, literally right across our border, has that, right? And I think it's just a matter of, continuing the dialogue that I'm sure Alan will be a part of are there some strategic partnerships that can really start to happen, even in our backyard, that will be able to build up greater diversity, but not always, can be concentrated in the United States as well. And that's also happening. So I think there's a ripe opportunity to leverage even our biggest and nearest trading partners to actually be part of this ecosystem.
Jerry?
Yeah, I think one of the best parts of the defense industrial strategy that came out last week was the really strong echoing of the importance of allies and partners and how they are part of our overall global industrial base, and how we need to work better together. And AUKUS is a clear demonstration of that. And I applaud that, and it's really, really strong to see. Every administration balances domestic production, buy America, and working with allies and partners. But this is, seeing this is really important. But there's a lot that we can do to really strengthen that, because these companies that are headquartered in our allied countries, they've been here they have subsidiaries here. They produce, they are primes on a lot of our weapon systems or major suppliers. This is nothing new, but strengthening how we build exportability into our systems, how do we partner with allies more proactively, and there's progress being made, but that is a way in which we can build additive capability, additive strength to our supply chains in a way that benefits the U.S. and the folks that we go to war with.
And I got to say, it works the other way too on export controls, not just on the, where are we buying from, but stopping sales to adversarial countries also has to be multilateral.
Yep.
Right? So if I stop, Applied Lam KLA from selling a tool to China, but the Netherlands or the Japanese can do it, I'm not accomplishing the goal.
Yeah. Right.
Right? So we need to work together. Unfortunately, we are.
How do you keep interjecting this? Just very briefly, we're going to go into a little bit of a lightning round as we go to the finish line. So how are you doing that, Alan? Right? There were washing machines that were going to Central Asia that are becoming Russian weapons. The Russians, unfortunately, are gaining the upper hand in Ukraine, especially as we slow roll aid to them. They're dying at rates that are unfortunate. It's just tragic. But from your standpoint, what are the things we have to do? Alan mentioned, for example, Mexico being a great value proposition. Well, the Chinese are setting up facilities in Mexico to be able to further access the American market, right? Walk us through the efforts you guys are making on third party, and how do we guard the Chinese from building factories in Canada and Mexico to import into the United States?
So those are all different levels of problem. For like diversion of stuff, so I have 160 or so federal officers that work for me, guns, badges, warrant power. And we, as your earlier point, we have a lot of data in the Department of Commerce. So we're looking at trade data and we're looking at flows. Chips flow through distributors for the most part, right? There are direct sales, but a lot of it goes through distribution networks. So we're looking at those distribution networks. We're looking at odd trade flows, washing machines, laptops, 12,000% increase of laptops to Armenia. Okay, so you go to Armenia and you say, 12,000% increase in laptops going to Armenia, and it's all going to 4 companies that didn't exist until March of 2022, right after the invasion. You guys can take care of this problem, or we'll take care of this problem by putting these people on the entity list. And for the most part, they take care of the problem. And then, China's a different issue on that, but we have, 70 companies on the entity list or some such number related to diversion of U.S. or allied goods going to Russia. And we're about to, as I just told Alan, we're about to start talking to companies about some additional data that we've seen. So we're on this. Now, I've also put people in handcuffs that are running Russian diversion networks. So it's hard work, though. It is very hard work.
Let me ask two quick questions and maybe give Alan the last word on this. Jerry, we were talking about rare earths and creating a rare earths capability in the United States. There are some primes who have opposed that. They'd much rather be buying cheaper rare earths from where they're available now and worrying about the problem later. Do you deal with this contractually? How do you get the mentality change? Because, some of these subcontractors are in trouble because the primes are hammering them. I'm not being anti-prime for those people who are prime people here. But, at the end of the day, they want to make money at the end of the day, right? And eventually, some of these smaller companies are forced to merge or have to get out of the business entirely if we're not ordering whatever we need to order. What's the intellectual, contractual, what are the mechanisms that we need to be using in order to be able to drive some of these strategic outcomes that folks are going to oppose until there's no opportunity but to embrace them?
Well, we have to identify kind of what are the capabilities that are essential to national defense, and we do that through, documents such as the executive orders that have been done in recent years, as well as, declarations on the Defense Production Act and the National Defense Strategy, and what are the areas where it's essential we have some national capability. And then we have to kind of help establish those, and then we have to, as the government has to help, they have to get the companies to have a commercialization strategy that allows it to be viable and over time. And so part of that is, the companies have to, they have to develop a commercialization strategy, but another part of it is government has to be able to backstop them to a degree in terms of if industrial policy of adversarial countries drives prices in a way which is sideways, then you have to, you have to put sanctions on them and the like. So I think it's just being intentional and conscious about some of these capabilities. And, I think the primes eventually will recognize, hey, listen, there's more cost in this capability because we need to have some domestic or allied capability.
Alan?
Before I came to Intel, I was at a prime. And so I think it's always going to be which cost are you willing to pay when, right? Because on the one hand, while you want that affordable supply chain, I remember how difficult things were during COVID, getting critical things. And I think that's the thing that's going to continue to shape, I think thinking going forward. I think the previous question on the allied partnership, though, is really, really important. Right, because I do think what we're going to see is we push on one end, governments can take actions that cause companies pain. And so, as our CEO always says, we used to be the just-in-time supply chain. He's embraced the idea you got to have just in case and be willing to absorb that cost. Because at the end of the day, you'd much rather manage, you don't want to be in a just-in-case situation because the cost is a lot greater.
But parking cars, if you're a GM at University of Michigan parking lot, because you don't have a chip for them, and you're only running at 70% capacity in your line anyway, is not an effective strategy for a company.
Yeah. Does there need to be one last thing very quickly across the piece, right? I mean, a lot of this is driven by Wall Street expectations and demands, right? But Wall Street can also be educated by the CEOs of the industry and by leadership and by members and everybody. You're laughing now, Alan. So do you want to take this first one? Well, how does this education process have to start to be able to say, look, don't judge me on my excess inventory. I do have to maintain industrial capacity and more footprint. I mean, the department was, rewarding companies to get rid of that footprint. And now all of a sudden, we didn't have it when we needed it. So you laughed, you get to answer the question.
The reason I laugh is our CEO is famous for saying that Wall Street thinks there's a fine line between ambitious and crazy, and they think Intel has crossed it, including him. But look, I would say, there's always the challenge of the short-term focus of a quarterly investment call, right, or earnings call. But I think, what the street is coming around to, and I think the last couple of years has helped that, is the recognition of just where things are going geopolitically, and an understanding that in some ways, even though they may not see the short-term payoff, and they will do what they need to do to manage their stakeholders, they recognize the value of doing some things from a strategic standpoint that are going to take longer to get the benefit from.
Guys, thanks very much. Alan, thank you very much. Ellen, thank you very much. And Jerry, a special thanks for being here on such short notice. Everybody, thanks very much. Really appreciate it, and an honor to be here.